Hey guys, welcome back to this second part of the TurbulenceFD series for the container object. In the last part, what we were talking about was the simulation tab, and we talked a little bit about the emitter tag as well and the different properties. So what we're going to do is we're going to continue on now with the container, but we're going to be talking about the viewport preview tab and also the rendering tab. So if we click on viewport preview, of course, we've already gone over the show bounding boxes and the show grid, I believe back in one of the first videos. Basically, that just shows what the voxel grid size looks like. If we uncheck show bounding boxes, that just gets rid of the box. That way you really can't see your container object. I tend to keep this option on just so I'm aware of where the container object is at. So the next one here would be channel, and we went over this a little bit earlier. This basically just gives you the option to choose what channel you want to view in the viewport. So what I've got is a sphere that's sitting here inside the container, and it has a tag on it. And I'm going to be emitting temperature, density, and burn. Burn will be for the fire, density will be for the smoke, and temperature, of course, will be to create the temperature to make everything rise. So back over in the container object, under simulation, I've got burn turned on as well as density and temperature. I also have a little turbulence, and I have vorticity here going up to a value of 2. So this just depends on what channel you want to see in the viewport. Now for something like this, more than likely, I'm probably just going to say, let's just see the fire. So I'm going to change it over to the burn. And then for the shader, we can leave it at none, or fire shader or smoke. We'll just choose the fire shader. So this here is just use shader color. You can actually change this if you want to down here with the custom color graph down here. You can use that with the bar. I usually just leave that option turned on just so I can see the fire shader. Preview mode, full slicing. So in order to see this, we need to simulate it first. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit simulate or start. And this is just going to simulate this really quick. And I'll just let it finish. All right, so we've got full slicing. Now, full slicing just basically means that you're going to be able to get a full 3D preview of your flame. So right now you can see that it is 3D. We can pan around it and it has volume and thickness to it. However, if we change this option here to single slice, basically we've just got one single slice. You can see it's almost as if it's a flat 2D image of a flame sitting there, and it will change. It's kind of adaptive. It will change as the camera pans around. But that's single slicing. That's what that looks like. So I usually just leave it at full slicing. Now you can also change it over here to none, and of course none will be none. So I tend to leave it at full slicing. That way I can actually get the full look and feel of everything, and you can actually pan around and get the thickness of everything. It just gives you the full 3D effect versus just having a single slice, which is basically just one 2D image going across the container. All right, slices per voxel, that just gives you the option to choose how many slices you want per voxel. Again, by default, it's set to 1. I usually leave it there, and that's just because I tend to just leave all of these settings here at default because they work pretty well for what I usually do when I use this plugin. So the next one here is going to be rendering. We have a general tab. This is going to be frame offset. You can give it a frame offset if you like, a frame step, step size, shadow step size, interpolation. Gives you different options here for fast, smooth, and sharp. We also have some other options down here. We'll get into that maybe a little bit later. These are things that you may not actually be using all the time when you use this plugin. The next one is the smoke shader. Now the smoke shader, remember we have density turned on. And if we go back over here and let's just look at the density channel and change it over to smoke shader, that's what we've got going on for density. So if we go back over here to rendering, we want the smoke to be done for the density. So right now it's set to none. So if we render this, what's going to happen is it's just going to look like that. So we need to change this smoke shader to where it only shades the density channel. So this mapping option here, let me just kind of zoom out so we can see this a little better. So we have smoke smoothing. Basically, this just smooths out the smoke. we have mapping. Now if you click on the little graph here, this little window will pop up, and this will give you the option to kind of move the handle around here on this bar graph to kind of change the way the smoke looks. So if we were to take this and pull it over to the right, notice that the smoke thinned out and it kind of dissipated more towards the top. So if we were to take this bar and pull it back over to the right, now we've got some really thick smoke. And if we render this, all right, so what we need to do first of all, the reason why it's doing this is because we have the fire shader set incorrectly. So let's go down to the fire shader, and the fire shader by default is set to temperature. So what I want to do is I want to change this over to burn. Okay, now we'll go back to the smoke shader. We'll render that again. All right, now the reason why it's looking like this is because we need to put some lights in here. So I'm just going to create an Omni light, and we'll give it soft shadows. And I'm going to pull it up, and then we'll just kind of pull it over to the side and go back with it just a little bit. All right, so there's a fire, there's the smoke. Now it's looking a whole lot better now. And more than likely, probably what we could do is actually duplicate the light and just pull the light back over here to this side just to illuminate that side. But we'll take this light and go down with the intensity a little bit. All right, so that's much better. Okay, so let's go back to the container object, and okay, let's click back on this mapping again to pull that back up. So we'll take the handle and we'll pull it back over to the right this time, and we'll render that. And you can see it looks a little different now. It's basically just been thinned out. It's not as thick and puffy as it was before. Okay, so I'm sure right about now you're probably wondering, wait a minute, this graph looks very confusing. How in the world am I supposed to understand this? Because so far all you've shown me is that if you pull the handle over to the left, things thicken up. If you pull it over to the right, the smoke gets thinned out. Okay, so I'm going to give you a brief explanation of how this graph works, and I hope it's going to be simple enough to understand. So this graph consists of two values. You have this bar down here on the bottom. This is the bottom horizontal bar. It starts at 0 and goes all the way up 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, all the way up to 1. And if we go beyond that, it will go beyond 1. This bottom horizontal bar represents the input value from the channel that we've selected. So in this case, we're using the density channel to shade the smoke. So this bottom bar here represents the input value coming from the density channel. Now the bar over here on the left, the vertical bar, represents the output value. In this case, it's driving the opacity. So to make this a little easier to understand, because I can understand that, all right, so in order, okay, so I'm going to give you a little example here. So let's just say we're just going to make this linear between the 2 points. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this handle here, represented at the top of this line, and I'm going to move it over to where it's at a value of 1 for the vertical bar. However, for the horizontal bar, it's going to be at 0.3. Then I'm going to take the handle down here at the very bottom, and I'm going to move that one over to a value of 0.1. So what this means is that if there are any voxels coming from the density channel that have a value, an input value coming from that density channel of 0.1 or lower, they will not be shaded at all. They will not have any opacity to them. However, if any of those voxels or any of the fluid that's being emitted from the density channel has a value of 0.3 or greater, then the opacity will be set to 1, which is basically 100%. So that's how this mapping graph works. Now I hope that my little explanation there has made sense to you. I know that this has got a little bit of a learning curve to it, and it might take a little time to get adjusted to it to learn it. and understand how it works. Now, this same type of mapping can also be used for the turbulence and vorticity fields as well. So if we were to, I'm just going to exit out of that. Let's go over to the simulation tab and let's open up something like turbulence. We can actually use one of the intensity channels here. So let's go and choose density, since we're working with the density here for the smoke. Click on the graph. And this is using the intensity. Now, you need to keep in mind that with the shading of the smoke, like we were doing a minute ago with the other graph, that was using the output values over here on the left, which was determining the opacity of the smoke. However, this vertical bar over here on the left isn't doing anything with opacity now. So basically these values over here on the left are determining the intensity value for turbulence rather than opacity when we were working with the shading of the smoke. So let me just repeat that real quick. Right now we're working with turbulence, so we're not having anything right now to do with opacity. This is basically just turbulence. So this bar graph over here on the left, this is not dealing with opacity. It's only dealing with the intensity of the turbulent field. Whereas on the other bar graph, which was here for the shading of the smoke, this bar graph over here, the vertical graph on the left, is now dealing with opacity. All right, so that pretty much sums up the mapping option here that you can use. All right, so we have separate opacity. This just here gives you the ability to choose one of the channels to control the mapping for that. I really haven't gotten into that yet, so maybe we'll come back to that. That's just another thing to add to the list that we could possibly talk about later. We have color and opacity. We have the thickness, which is currently set to 15, and we have the brightness, which is set to 100. Now, before we get into that, I'm just going to take this mapping back and set it back to where it was by default, which was there. So we have the thickness, which we can take this, and these values here, which is thickness and brightness and the smoke color, we can change these and they will update automatically. You don't have to re-simulate this in order to see the effect from any of these changes here, from the thickness, the brightness, or the smoke color. So we could take this and make it, I don't know, maybe a bright green color. And we can take the brightness and we can bring the brightness down. You can see it's changing on the fly. We're not having to re-simulate any of this. And the thickness, now I don't think we're going to be able to see this in the viewport. Oh, actually we will. Okay, that's good to know. All right, so we can see the thickness in the viewport update as well. And there's our odd green smoke. So these values here, you don't have to re-simulate to see them. So of course, thickness, brightness, and smoke color, that's pretty simple to understand. So the next one here is the subgrid detail. I'm just going to change this back to a better color. Take the brightness back up, and we'll bring this back down. Okay. So the next one here would be subgrid detail. Now this is one that I have yet to get into. None of the jobs that I've actually used TurbulenceFD on have actually required me to go in here to play around with any of these settings. Now I'm sure that we could probably go to the JAWSet website and read the manual on this. I think I'd mentioned before that there's a manual on TurbulenceFD. You can go online to get it, and it actually has a lot of good explanations in there of what a lot of this stuff does. So maybe we'll come back to that a little later, but I have yet to actually use it. So up next we have illumination. Now we have different modes here. We have none, fast, smooth, and accurate. None means none at all. There will not be any illumination. Now by default it was set to voxelize fast. This is the lowest setting. Like think of it as the lowest resolution. We have smooth, which would be medium resolution, and then we have accurate, which would be, think of it as maybe like high resolution. But accurate, of course, is going to take more time to render. And smooth will take more time to render versus fast. So by default, fast usually works pretty good. Sometimes if it doesn't look right, you may want to take that up to maybe smooth. But just remember that the higher you take it, it's going to take a little longer to render. The next one is scattering, and more than likely I'm probably going to be pronouncing this incorrectly. I believe it's anisotropy. I think. I'm not quite sure about that. More than likely, I'm probably wrong. But this value here deals with light scattering. Whenever the light hits this gas, in this case the smoke, it's either going to be absorbed or it's going to bounce. This option here just gives you the ability to control in which direction it's going to bounce. Now I believe a value of 0 means it's going to bounce in all different directions. So the next one is illumination resolution. This gives you the ability to control, goes down to 0, and I believe it will go past 100. Yes, it will. This just gives you the ability to control the resolution, which usually at 100 works pretty well. We have multiple scattering here for the next one. Now, by default, this option is turned off. Now, think of multiple scattering as global illumination. So by default, it's turned off. So if we were to turn this on, what this means is that the light coming from the fire will actually start to give off light, and it will illuminate the clouds or the smoke around it. So if we were to just render a little area here down towards the bottom, and more than likely I probably need to make that a little thicker. So let's take the mapping here and let's make it a little thicker. Okay, so notice that the smoke that's around the flame, it's not being illuminated at all by the light coming from the flame. The only light that we have are these two lights here. So if I were to turn those two lights off, and let's render that again, more than likely we need to probably turn off the auto light. Okay, we'll go over into the render settings, we'll go to options, and we want to turn off the default light, which back in the old days of like R8, R9, and R10, it was called the auto light. So we'll just turn that off. We'll render that again. Okay, so you can see that the smoke is there, but the fire is not illuminating the smoke at all. So if we go back over and turn on multiple scattering, that flame should start to illuminate the smoke a little bit, but you need to keep in mind that it has to calculate a pre-pass first. So this is going to increase your render time. So let's see what the default settings do when we render that. Now notice down here in the bottom left-hand corner, it gave us a little bit of a calculation going on there, and notice that it was actually pretty quick, but now you can see that the smoke is starting to be illuminated, whereas before it was not. So we can actually change the max depth here. We can change the directional resolution, the fall off, the light brightness, and the fire brightness. Now what these properties here do is the max depth, think of it as the max bounces for a GI setting. So whenever you're kind of playing around with global illumination, it gives you the ability to control how many bounces there are. So think of the depth here as kind of like the bounces. So right now we just got 1. So if we take this up to 2, then we should start to see a little more smoke being illuminated. And then we can take the fire brightness and we can take this up as well, which means the fire will actually emit more light. So we'll give that a minute to calculate pre-pass, and then we'll render it again, and we can see a little bit more smoke. We can also control the fall off and the light brightness. Now this light brightness here deals with the lights that are in this scene. And we currently have them turned off. So let's take the max depth up to something like 3, and let's take the fire brightness up to something like maybe 550. And down here in the bottom left, notice it says multiple scattering pass 2 of 2. So it actually has to calculate this pass first before it actually starts to render. Alright, so we could probably take the depth and go up a little higher. Let's try 8. That's probably going to be way too high. But I just want to see what type of effect we can get. And you can see it's taking a little longer to render. That pre-pass down here, the multiple scattering pass, is taking a little longer to render that. So we'll just give this a couple seconds, and there we go. Now we could probably take the thickness down to something like 5 and play around with the graph. And now we should get a completely different look here to this. There should probably be more of the smoke that's actually illuminated this time. All right, so I think you get the point of this. This multiple scattering here just basically works like global illumination. And of course, if we turn that option back off, then no more of the smoke is being illuminated. All right, so the next one will be fire shader. Of course, the channel, that's pretty simple. We've already been over that. We've got fire smoothing, just smooths it out. So the next one is clear smoke if above. And what this value does, it allows you to put a value in to specify if you want your fire to erase the smoke. Because sometimes you may have a lot of smoke that's inside of your flame and you can't really see the flame. So maybe you want a clearer flame that you can, that you're able to see a lot clearer, but you can't because there's smoke in the way. So this option gives you the ability to control that flame to actually, I guess you could say, erase the smoke. That way the smoke doesn't get in the way of actually viewing the flame. Maybe we can get back into that a little bit later. Of course, we also have the mapping here for the flame. So by default, we've just got a basic linear line going here, going up and then going back down. Now, if we switch back over to burn, fire, and what I want to do for this, I want to turn on the turbulence and let's take it up a little higher. Okay, I'm just going to resim this really quick. Tell you what, let's make this a little bigger. Okay, so we'll go back over to the rendering. We're going to pull up the graph again here for the fire. Now, usually I kind of play around with this because sometimes I like my fire to look really thick, other times I don't. So if we were to take the graph here, pull it over to the right a little bit, you can see it kind of thickened up a lot. If we pull it back over to the left, it looks a little more like orange in the middle and the flames are not as thick. Now over here on the left-hand side of this ramp, we can kind of pull this one inward and it kind of made the outside a little more contrasted. Pull this out to the left and it thickens it up a little bit. So again, it just depends on what you want your fire to look like. And of course, this graph works the same way as I described earlier. These values down here on the bottom are the input values coming from the burn channel, and these values over here on the left on the vertical bar here are representative of the color. So you can see we've got black, red, orange, all the way up into yellow and then white. All right, so we've also got separate opacity for that. We've got color. The color opacity by default is set to 2. If we take this value up, it's just going to make the flame more apparent, but it's also going to emit more light because basically what we're doing here is we're taking the opacity up. The background behind it will be more obscured, but it will also be emitting more light. So we have the color mode here, which is black body, or we can go manual. Manual just gives you the ability here to actually control this down here with these different sliders here on this bar. However, for fire, I usually just stick with black body and it works just fine. We also have low temp, high temp, white point, damping, red, green, and blue. So the low temp, if we play around with this and bring it down, or let's try to go up with it, you can see what just basically happened. I went up way too high with it. So I'll just go back and forth. You can see the difference in what it's doing there. If I play around with the high temp, that's going to give us a really weak flame. Or you can take it up, make it really bright. Let's pull it down a little bit to maybe something like there. All right, so we've also got white point. Again, that just basically kind of just adjusts the white point. We've got the damping here. And we've also got red, green, and blue. Now this comes in handy if you want to change the color of your flame and you don't want to mess around with it up here. You can actually just take all of the red out, and what we should get is a little bit of a green colored flame. And we can take out all of the green, and that's basically just going to give us blue, which I think will probably render as black. Yeah. Okay, so we'll give it all of the red again. So you can play around with these different settings here just to get different colors into your fire if you don't want to use the option up here, which is manual. Okay, so I think I've kind of gone over this long enough. A lot of this stuff is pretty easy to understand, all of these different color options and all of this stuff here. Subgrid detail, again, the subgrid detail is the same here as it is over for the smoke shader. I have yet to actually get into it, to actually play around with any of these settings, because usually the default settings have worked just fine for me for all the work that I've done using this plugin. Okay, so I think that pretty much wraps up this video on the conclusion for the container object. Like I said previously, I didn't want to make this boring, but I wanted to kind of go over some of these things just to give you an idea of what they do. So as always, thank you guys for watching. In the next video, we're going to go over the emitter tag and all the different properties for that. And then hopefully we'll just kind of maybe make something after that, put something together. All right, so thank you for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video.